Welcome. Can you hear me in the back? I'm always concerned about making sure we're communicating effectively. And I always hate to shut down our conversation. So I'm very glad to see those of you in person, and for those of you participating on Zoom, thank you for joining. I'm Kate Cagney, the director of the Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan, and I'm so glad you could join us today for the next installment in our ISR Insight Speaker Series. Many of you are familiar with ISR, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you about it again, just so you know. ISR has over 300 affiliated faculty who, along with our excellent staff, conduct research that addresses topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics and public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics, including teen drug use, economic behavior, aging, and health. Our faculty come from almost every school and college at the University of Michigan, reflecting the true interdisciplinary nature of our research and our broader impact. A full schedule of Insights talks is available on the ISR website, isr.umich.edu, as well as recordings of past talks in the series. We'll post a video of today's event there as well. So let me tell you a little bit more about today. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Nick Valentino. He's professor of political science and research professor in the Center for Political Studies. He currently serves as a PI of the American National Election Study, or ANES. It's as well known around here. Nick specializes in political, psychological approaches to understanding public opinion formation, socialization, information seeking, and electoral participation. His work employs experimental methods, surveys, and content analysis of political communication. He's written extensively on the causes and consequences of empathy for ethnic outgroups. His latest book, Seeing Us and Them, Social Divisions and the Politics of Group Empathy, is collaborative work with Shida Shirin and Jose Villalobos of the University of Texas at El Paso, and they're listed here as your co-authors. The book explores the nature of outgroup empathy in political divisions, examining the factors that push certain individuals to see past the divisions that others can't overcome. Seeing Us and Them has been recognized with multiple awards since its publication in the spring of 2021, so congratulations, including Best Book honors from the International Society for Political Psychology and the American Political Science Association. Drawing on this work, Nick's talk today examines the role of outgroup empathy as a potential driver of support for restrictive voting laws and voter suppression efforts. And I also just want to say again, I keep reflecting on the talk from your panel, thinking about our post-election results and how you did that framing. So thankful for your insights yet again here. I just also want to share a few housekeeping things. There are folks joining us on Zoom. Please note we're providing live captioning of the event, and you can view those captions by turning on the closed captioning feature on your screen. And also we'll have a Q&A, of course, at the end of the presentation. We'll take questions both in the room, but also on Zoom, and those can be submitted, right, Catherine, through the Q&A feature, and Catherine will be sharing them with me, and I will read them out. Thank you again for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming Nick. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate all of you being here. I always say this at the beginning of my talks, I'm making the rookie mistake of trying to present too much, and I do want to hear your thoughts and questions. I know that this is one of those rare opportunities, even though we live in such an interdisciplinary building, to actually be in front of an interdisciplinary audience. So thank you for coming, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have any, either here or afterwards. You can find me upstairs on the 4th floor. So this work, as Kate mentioned, is an extension of the book, and thank you for that plug. I'll make another shameless plug here in a second. But the talk, I want to make sure I introduce the theory in case you haven't heard of it, but then I'm going to move quickly to an extension of the theory for thinking about an issue of great importance, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many political scientists, which is the potentially negative democratic consequences of voter restrictions and new voter laws that have been ramping up since 2020. But before we get to that, let me briefly review the theory itself. So the first point I'd like to make is that we believe that there exists a predisposition which varies across individuals that can trigger the vicarious experience of perspectives and emotions between ethnic and racial groups This is not in-group or interpersonal empathy of the kind that, for example, many psychologists study, the kind of empathy that we have, that we experience for our closest kin, our friends, our children. This is a different kind of empathy, something that is probably, as a result of the way empathy works, rarer than empathy for our closest kin. That is, it occurs less often and it's probably less intensely felt, but it can condition reactions to threats, especially when thinking about the way that governments treat different groups differently in society, and that's the political part. So our point is that outgroup empathy is a predisposition that will probably vary substantially within all partisan, ideological, and racial groups. But as a result of different experiences during socialization, we would expect different groups on average to experience different levels, mean levels of outgroup empathy for other groups in need, other groups that are being discriminated against. And now the technological trick will be to show you an example of why I think that different groups in America might develop different levels of outgroup empathy. And I want to show you an example of a news story that will be both, I'm sure not many of you have seen this story, but it's going to strike a lot of very common experiences for us as Americans, because it is an example of an African-American family being pulled over by the police at night. Now, there is no violence, there is no physical violence in this clip. The family is safe. I wanted to make sure everybody knew that that wasn't coming, but it's still a very scary clip, especially based on what we now have witnessed as a society for many years, many decades, but especially over the last 5 to 10 years with regard to police violence. So again, the reason I want to show you this example is that I want to argue that some groups experience discrimination directly, especially in their interactions with government and with branches, with elements of government, including the criminal justice system. And then our argument is as a socializing experience, both in terms of its direct effect on the individual and the socializing effect on their children and the stories that people tell their children, this will lead to different levels of outgroup empathy later in life. That's a very big claim. I'm not going to show you any evidence whatsoever to prove that that actually happens. It's just my claim. But if that is true, then we will expect a bunch of downstream consequences, and those can be empirically measured. So I'm going to see if I can do this right. So we're going to do this here, and then what do I do? I go here.
And then to the right, full screen.
What I wanted. One second, what? Yeah, so much for that.
That's the end.
Not what I wanted, Mike. Look up there on the bar, maybe there's another version of it. Up further, up on the tab. Right, no, to the left. There, on that. Okay, can we run that? That's it.
No, as soon as I go full screen, it doesn't want to work.
Yeah, all right.
It's okay to not be full screen. No, not that one. Okay. All right, so now what we need to do is go back to that original link. Yeah. Okay.
Let me see your hands.
Okay, thanks.
See your hands out the window.
This is the moment that shook Kamisha Barber's belief that bad things do not happen to good people. Her car loaded up with small children, her hands above her head, then shackled in cuffs. Moments later, her 6-year-old son Ryan comes out too, with his hands in the air.
Makes me angry all over.
How did this happen? Well, it started with this 911 call and a very clear description of a vehicle speeding down the highway, driver possibly waving a gun out the window.
It is going to be a beige or tan-colored Toyota, occupied by 4 black males.
I drive a Nissan Maxima that is burgundy red.
No match. But after the suspect car sped far down the road, the 911 caller was now far back and thought the suspect was exiting the highway. That's the very exit where police spotted Camille Barber's car.
The complainant that called in said that vehicle took that exit.
Yes, sir. What is wrong? My kids. They're 6 and 8 and 10, 9. What are we doing? Sir, what is going on? Why do you care about my children?
You got a complaint, vehicle matching your description, your license plate.
In less than a minute, the officers knew they had the wrong car. You could hear them de-escalate.
They do to me.
Within moments, the officers are trying to calm the children's nerves.
It's okay. No, it's don't jail. It's fine. Everything. Hey, stop crying. It's okay. It's okay. Everything's fine now.
Were they treated properly? Was this a proper stop that they needed to be subjected to that kind of
For the nature of the
intensity?
call, that a weapon was involved, yes.
Barber understands the officers were making quick decisions that night. Nonetheless, she is still deeply troubled.
I need you to make sure that you have all the facts. It doesn't, you can't just say, okay, I'm sorry, I'm over it. I can't. I mean, every time I listen to or hear or think about it, it bothers you. It's not, I can't just say, okay, I'm fine. It's okay. It's not a big deal. It is.
Especially when you're 6 years old.
Back with, we have to turn this off or it's going to play another video. I'd like to make it as hard as possible to get this talking.
Regarding his company's recent train derailment in Ohio, Alan Shaw said to
Okay, wonderful, thank you. All right, so 2 reasons to show you the clip again. One, to show you an example of a set of experiences that some groups in America have at a much higher, much more likely to have both directly or to be indirectly, but pretty closely as a result of experiences through their family or other members of their group that they know about. That we know that this is true. I'm not an expert in the statistics on this, but we know that on average that these kinds of very stressful experiences are more common among African American families, for example. That's not the only group that it's more common for than they are among whites. And why? So what effect is that going to have? One effect is going to be these very intense emotional experiences are learning experiences for the children. They know how it feels to be in this situation. This is, we think, going to create the skill, the ability to transport themselves into the minds of others experiencing this kind of treatment, even when they're not members of their close family or even of their ethnic or racial group. It will allow them to more easily empathize with other groups being mistreated or treated unfairly by the government, by organs of the government. That's one thing. Now, of course, the other point, though, is that it wouldn't surprise me at all if many or all of you were experiencing empathy for the mother as she was terrified about the treatment of her children, the safety of her children. These folks had their guns drawn on little kids. This is scary. And so every time I watch it, my skin starts to, the hair goes up on my back because I think this is terrifying to imagine our children in this situation. That is a form of empathy. That is a consequence of empathy that we're having. And that's to say that all groups experience empathy for other people, even strangers. There is variation across individuals, we think, in this dimension. We try to measure it using survey measures, which I'll show you. But this is not to say that only African Americans or other minority groups experience empathy for outgroups. That's one of the main arguments of the book is that in fact, there will be differences between groups, but there's plenty of variation within groups as well in terms of how likely they are to empathize. So this is the shameless plug for the book, but I want to show you a couple of findings from the book, but mostly I want to move on to this more current discussion about whether it might have anything to do with the development of policy relevant attitudes such as support or opposition to policies that restrict access to the vote that may or may not target particular groups in society. So, okay, it's maybe hard to see. This is something from the book. So here you can see, for example, one of the puzzles that drove our interest in starting this book, writing this book back, and we started this in 2010 or 2011, collecting data. So this is not because of Trump that we wrote the book or because of any contemporary policies. We were thinking about this before, and one of the reasons we were thinking about it is we kept finding this top finding here. You can see that these three bars are, well, maybe you can't see, but the three bars are, the top bar is whites, the middle bar is African Americans, and the bottom bar is Latino respondents to a nationally representative survey. And what we find repeatedly, not just in this study, but in many studies, is that African Americans are more opposed to the border wall than Latino Americans. And this is even among those who identify as Democrats, even those who even controlling for ideology. African Americans end up opposing policies like border separation, the wall. They have higher support for DACA, even often more than Latinos do, but definitely more than whites on average. So this is an example of, we think, one of the consequences. It's not just in-group policies that affect the in-group, like Confederate symbols or Black Lives Matter, which of course African Americans are scoring higher on support for those policies as well. It's also for policies that target other groups, that target groups that are not African American. So I'm going to skim and we think this has something to do with outgroup empathy. All right, we think this has something to do with the fact that they can put themselves in the shoes of other groups. We have a ton more evidence than that in the book. We have lots and lots of evidence for it. So I'd love for you to take a look at that book and see if you agree. We've arrived at these 4 items. Political scientists often abandon all reason in order to fit scales on the American National Election Study. And in order to do that, you can't ask very many questions. So this is based on Davis's IRI, the interpersonal reactivity scale that he invented in the early 1980s. And that scale had 4 dimensions, 4 subdimensions, and 20 different items. They were Likert type items, agree, disagree. We modified those. We did a bunch of pre-testing. We had some reverse ordered items. There was such a strong effect of the reversal that we decided to just go with these 4, and they're all, as you can see, if you're a measurement person and a econometrics person, you know this is breaking some of the rules, but these 4 items are what composes the outgroup empathy scale that we ultimately use most often in the book, and which appears on American National Election Study in 2020. So we have 2 perspective taking items and 2 empathic concern items. We think it's the combination of the ability to take the perspective of another group, as well as concern about what happens to the other group once you are there in their shoes. That's the combination we think is the conceptual definition of empathy that makes the most sense, especially in the political realm. And you can see, if you're familiar with the Davis scale, that these are just simple modifications of the Davis items. So for example, the first one, how often would you say you try to better understand people of other racial ethnic groups by imagining how things look from their perspective, mirrors an item by Davis, which says, I sometimes try to understand my friends better by imagining how things look from their perspective. So the only difference there really is this focus on other racial or ethnic groups. And we make similar small changes to other items in the index in order to create this outgroup empathy scale. Now, these changes might be small enough that you wouldn't really expect them to behave differently when predicting policy views or anything else. That's one criticism we've received. Or they're so vague and abstract that they shouldn't predict anything at all, let alone something differently than the IRI would. And I'm going to show you contrary evidence to those concerns quickly, and then I'll move to the electoral laws part. So first of all, the differences we saw, for example, we see large differences between African Americans and whites, for example, in reactions to or support for policies to combat terrorism and opposition to immigration. We worry perhaps that that's simply a result of maybe personal concerns might be higher among or lower among African Americans. For example, if we see African Americans much less likely to support opposition to strict border laws and racial stereotyping at the border in order to stop terrorism, that might be because they are simply less concerned than white people about these things. That's not true. The personal threat of terrorism is consistently higher among African Americans than it is among Latinos. The national threat of terrorism perceptions of the national threat of terrorism is not different across the groups, but yet we see much higher levels of empathy for refugees, Muslims, Arabs, and then the general score on the GEI, the Group Empathy Index, is always, in our data that we have now 7 or 8 different nationally representative samples, always higher, controlling for partisanship, controlling for ideology. I even have some data, which I won't show you in the talk, where we try to examine this compared to other measures of racial attitude, like social dominance orientation, racial resentment, and other measures, and we don't find that they are we don't find that the effect of empathy is explained by those other dimensions. But I'll just show you quickly one result from the book, which is that when we compare the effect of the Davis IRI, which is what we think of as the interpersonal empathy scale, the one where we think the focus is on friends and close kin, we see that it has almost nothing to do with support for punitive immigration policies, for example. But the Group Empathy Index has a massive effect, and that's controlling for standard measures of partisan and political attitudes as well. I want to leave now the book, and again, I hope that I haven't gone either too fast or too slow on that stuff. You should feel free to ask me questions about the book itself, but I really want to focus on this paper that we're currently finishing up, which is to apply this idea of outgroup empathy to the domain of election restrictions. And the reason why we want to do that, of course, is that after 2020, actually before 2020, there's a bunch of false claims about the substantial election fraud that are being used to restrict access to the ballot using a variety of policies in many battleground states and with large minority populations. I hope you're all familiar with this so that I don't need to review the examples of it, but it's pretty explicit that, and in fact, several politicians who support these laws have slipped up and publicly admitted that the reason they would like these laws to pass is to restrict access to the ballot among certain groups, in particular Democratic groups, that would be the goal of those policies, not actually to reduce fraud, which even Republicans don't actually, or at least at the time prior to 2020, didn't actually believe was a very big problem. So our claim is that if people are aware of the fact that these laws target minority groups, then they should bring their empathy to bear. If they have empathy for outgroups, they should bring it to bear on support for those policies. If they don't, then they shouldn't, because it's not obvious the way most of the time these laws are framed by the right. It's not obvious that they're targeting specific groups. They're targeting election fraud. They're trying to reduce the mythical election fraud that has plagued our system for so many cycles since Trump was on stage. Actually, this story came out yesterday in the Washington Post, and I really wanted to show a clip from this, but I'm not going to. But it's about these guys who showed up at these ballot drop boxes in Arizona and Maricopa County during the 2022 election, and in body armor and with guns holstered, with face masks, sitting on the back of flatbed trucks right around the ballot box. And police were repeatedly called in with the claim that this is voter intimidation, that people are scared to go drop off their ballots because of all these armed, looked like vigilantes sitting around waiting to stop people from voting. And there's several examples of cops trying to talk to these folks about exactly what they think they're up to and why they need to be there. And what is the definition of voter harassment or intimidation? And why, in an open carry state like Arizona, aren't they allowed to sit next to a ballot drop box with their giant weapon holstered like that? I probably didn't need to say all that to this audience, but I just wanted it to be in the talk that this is a real thing happening in the United States. And it's happening in Maricopa County. If you know about Arizona, you know that Maricopa County is different politically than the rest of Arizona. That's where votes would need to be suppressed if you didn't want Democrats to be elected in Arizona. You would really want to focus on Maricopa County. So what we wonder, though, is does your empathy for outgroups get engaged or not if you don't know about the group-based intention or motivation of these laws? The answer should probably be no, that you don't think that would happen. And so we want to test that observationally. We obviously can't test this experimentally. So we're going to look at some observational data, and then we'll talk about whether you guys believe the conclusion. So we suspect actually that these laws will only trigger outgroup empathy if people know about their intention. So first of all, we wanted to say, many people have claimed that minorities experience greater obstacles in voting as a result of these laws. Voter identification laws that have been around for 15 years. These newer laws restricting the ballot access are even more interventionist. They're, I would call them at least inconveniences and sometimes more, like the scare tactics around the ballot boxes. It's actually hard to find empirical evidence, though, that non-whites are turning out at lower rates as a result of these things. And one of the reasons we think that happens is that people get really pissed when you inconvenience them, and they actually turn out at rates higher than they would have. That doesn't mean that the laws aren't intended to demobilize or don't have in the long run the effect of demobilizing, but it could mean that as a result, in the short term, anger is mobilizing against those laws, and so you actually see turnout higher among these groups, not lower. We think something like that might be true for empathy as well, although that would only be if people know about it. So I'm going to show you pretty quickly. First of all, I'm going to show you some evidence that at least in terms of what people will self-report on the American National Election Study, minorities do perceive in 2020 greater obstacles to voting than white folks. But then I'm going to show you some of the relationships between empathy as we've measured it, as I've showed you, in opposition to these laws, to these voter restrictions.
May I just ask a quick
Question? Yeah. Sophisticated.
Yeah.
Oh, we measure it in a few different ways. One way we measure it is just level of education when we don't have better measures than that. And then another way is to use, in the American National Election Study, there's a series of questions about the identification of sort of political sophistication. How knowledgeable are you about the way government works and who represents you and various offices? It's not a great, our colleague Skip Lupia will tell you this is not a great way to measure political sophistication. And he's right, but it's all we have, and we hope that it's at least correlated with the underlying dimension we're interested in. We can use different measures and we get the same result. So let's see. So we have two studies. I might only have time to show you one of them today, and I can show you the rest of the data if we have time. But I want to get to question and answer, and I know we have limited time. So here's a few dependent variables that just ask in the American National Election Study in 2020, these are just predictors of how much time, at least self-reported, it took to get to the polling station. How long did you wait? How difficult was it for you to vote? And these are all scaled from 0 to 1. So these are small results, small effects, but consistently, one of the only things that predicts, that significantly predicts, positively predicts trouble or inconvenience is being a non-white voter. That's one of the only things that predicts whether you're experiencing higher levels of obstacles. So the reason I put this slide up is just, it's actually pretty rare to show even any significant differences across these groups, at least in the data so far. That might be increasing. Those differences might be increasing over time as we make it harder and harder for certain communities to vote. When we look at how empathy affects support for more group equitable electoral outcomes, this is more or less a validation of our scale more than a theoretical prediction. We get the expected result. That is, empathy controlling for other predispositions and group differences strongly predicts whether you would support more equitable representation for minority groups across society. And then the first substantive prediction about the effect of empathy on voting restrictions is here. Again, a rather small substantive effect when controlling for other predispositions, but still statistically significant. That is, the higher your outgroup empathy, the more you oppose voting restrictions. But you can see that this is almost entirely driven by people who are politically sophisticated, who are more likely to know something about politics and therefore perhaps know about the intention of these laws, the group-based intention of these laws, the minority targeting of these laws, a very significant interaction between empathy and political sophistication. Here's the graphical display of that interaction. The blue line is the effect of group empathy among those who are scoring pretty low on political sophistication. And the green line is the effect of, or the association between group empathy and voter support for voter restrictions, opposition to voter restrictions among those who are highly sophisticated. So a much steeper slope, as you'd expect. Yeah, then I repeat this in the next sample, and then we get the same basic result that highly educated respondents in this is a 2022 study. Highly educated respondents are engage their empathy and oppose voting restrictions. Those lower in education do not engage their empathy because presumably they don't know about the group targeting. We're also going to be collecting another data set actually right now during this week, where we replicate this finding again, and we'll have better measures of sophistication as well. So to let you ask questions, I want to get right to the conclusions. We find pretty strong associations between outgroup empathy and public opposition to these laws. We can control for partisanship, ideology, and other things. Those effects don't go away. All of the associations that we find are substantially larger among the most sophisticated in these samples. So I guess our next step would be to further explore the effectiveness of counter-mobilizing strategies on the basis of outgroup empathy when the group targeting is made explicit in these debates, which I think is more and more true. Stacey Abrams, when she was going around door to door in Georgia, this was her primary mobilization message. It was, they are trying to demobilize you. They are trying to take away your vote. You have to turn out to vote to stop them from doing this. This was the message that she used most often, according to the evidence we have so far of the content analysis of her strategy so far. So thank you very much. That's my last slide, and I have other data to show you if you ask me the right questions. But otherwise, I'd just like to hear your questions. Thank you very much.
Want to go ahead and field your own questions, and then I will jump in if we get them on Zoom.
I'm happy.
Great.
I might.
How are you, Nick?
Good.
Very interesting presentation. Most of your data collection takes place in the context of the ANES and involves survey questions as independent and dependent variables. What would your guess be about a survey-based experiment that used vignettes, where somebody described the motivation of the laws, and there was a control group in which the vignette didn't mention the intent of the proposed laws?
Yeah, that's a nice design, and we've talked about that on the team. And we may run that exact experiment. But we've done in the book, if you take a look at the book, we've done a lot of experiments like that. I have some that aren't on these laws, but they're on, let's see if I can show you a quick one. So here's an experimental result from 2013, where we actually randomly assign people to vignettes that are either showing a white or an Arab passenger trying to get on an airplane and are detained, racially profiled and detained. And we see whether, because of our belief that these different groups will react differently as a result of different levels of empathy, which we show later is in fact the mediator, we can see that when you go from a white passenger to a non-white passenger, we have a dramatic decline in siding with the passenger among white respondents in this experiment. But again, we've randomly assigned the race of the passenger. So these groups are presumably the same other than the pictures that they see. But African Americans and Latinos are actually more supportive of the passenger even when they're white. And they remain supportive of the passenger on average, or at least not dramatically lower, when the passenger is Arab. So we have a lot of experiments like this, which are in spirit the same kind of thing that you're talking about, which is when you make the group salient, what direction are these different groups going to move. Now notice we haven't randomly assigned empathy here. That would be the thing you really wanted to know, is it empathy or something else. We don't think we can randomly assign empathy, like we can't randomly assign any ethnocentrism, racial attitudes, SDO, etc. But we keep finding patterns like this. So I know that's not a direct answer, but it is. Your suggestion is a good one, and we've thought about it and may run it. Maybe we'll wait and see if anyone likes the results that we have observationally before we run that nice experiment.
Okay, I have a question from Edie. Do you have any evidence of how an individual's outgroup empathy varies over time?
Well, we don't have panel data on outgroup empathy. We've never asked the same individuals these outgroup empathy questions at two different points in time. I guess I shouldn't guess what exactly will happen on the 2024 American National Election Study, despite my being PI. But I would hope that that would be the first time that we would have these measures 4 years apart for the same individuals, because we will have a panel, a reasonably sized panel to ask. And I would love to see those results. So the answer is no, but soon, hopefully.
Thank you for your talk. I guess my question is more theoretical and more philosophical regarding your theory on outgroup empathy, but is the assumption behind the theory that empathy will always lead to action?
That's a great question. And I think the answer has to be no, that empathy won't always lead to action. It'll depend on what happens once you transport yourself into the mind of the other person. This sounds like a person that would ask this question would be a psychologist, trained as a psychologist. So yeah, I don't want the audience to assume that empathy is a positive emotion, or is something that will lead people to necessarily be always be kind or always do the right thing or anything like that. That's not what empathy is, and it's not what it does. But in these cases, with regard to political discrimination as a result of interactions with organs of government, we think that is going to create anger actually on the part of the empathizer. And that anger could be mobilizing. So when that happens, yes, we think it will mobilize, but if it creates fear or disgust or aversion or something like that, then no, we wouldn't expect it to trigger mobilization. Rob?
Thanks, Nick. That is great stuff. Yeah, I'm thinking also about the Stacey Abrams stuff because there doesn't seem to be any out-group dynamics there. Like she could have been using the first person plural, like we're taking our rights, right? So you had this slide at the end about future research on effectiveness of counter-mobilizing strategies. I kind of feel like so I was starting to think, well, maybe you could do a field experiment to see what kind of appeals work in a Green and Gerber way or whatever, but actually it seems like the thing that you really want to test is the ability of groups to attract activists, right? And it's their ability to mobilize people to do the counter mobilizing on the basis of out-group empathy, right? One other totally random thought. I mean, if Lily Mason's right and these partisanship and party identities are now akin almost to group identities, then the frame of these laws as being partisan, would that lead Republicans to empathize with out-group Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, in my paper.
That's kind of a smart aleck question, but it's not totally smart.
Well, since I know you've read the paper, the original paper that looked at counter mobilization against voter ID laws, because you've been so kind as to read that paper and tell me how you felt about that. I would remind you, and I think you don't need reminding, but remind the audience that in that paper we find it's not African Americans who are mobilized by this message about how the laws are intended to demobilize Black folks. It's other white Democrats who we presume, although we didn't measure it, are higher in out-group empathy, who are mobilized by this message. So, and that's why we don't see any decrement in turnout in the aggregate. It's because not just the targeted group is getting counter-mobilized, but sympathetic outgroups are getting mobilized in large numbers. And to answer your partisanship question, we actually had a frame in that paper that was not about racial group targeting, but about partisan targeting. This group, these are trying to demobilize Democrats as opposed to trying to demobilize African American voters. And that was not as effective, at least when we ran that study. That was in the middle of the last decade. So maybe, I do think Lily's right. I would assume that she's even more right now than she used to be. So that would imply that actually these are such strong identities that now you can just, you could say, well, I hate to make a terrible prediction here, but yeah, if this is a group identity, then people should have some empathy for outgroups, even across partisan lines, as hard as that. That's the theory, is that even groups in competition, even groups that are seen as threatening. I mean, I have some other data here that even though African Americans think they are in competition with Latinos and other minority groups for jobs and resources in society and policy benefits, they are still much more likely to extend those benefits to those outgroups than white folks are, even though they perceive themselves to be in competition with those groups. So if that could be applied to the partisan debate, then it should happen that people high in outgroup empathy, even among Republicans, even among Democrats who are highly partisan, should say it's not fair to treat the outgroup that way and should try to stop that kind of unfair treatment. That would be my maybe too risky prediction. Yes.
I have a question from Tyrone. How is your concept different or similar to Chuddy's theory of racial sympathy?
Well, I like, that's a great question, and I like Jen's work very much. I would say that at least my interpretation of the difference is that Jen's work is really trying to understand why a majority group would end up taking the side of an oppressed group. And her idea there is that sympathy has to have something to do with it. And my view, maybe she would disagree, is that sympathy is about in part, there's a hierarchical nature to sympathy. That is that you're more likely to have sympathy for a group that is at a lower station in society because it's unfair the way they're being treated. The empathy idea is, I think, I'd like to believe is broader than that, because it can be, at least we think our data show that African Americans oppose the mistreatment of white folks when they are being mistreated by government as well. This is not because they are sympathetic toward white folks in general, or think that they're a group that is generally mistreated, but because they place themselves in the minds of these individual members of another group and they say that's not fair. So that's why it's different. I don't think, for example, this result is about sympathy for white folks among Black folks. I think we would argue it's about empathy, because the racial hierarchy there is in the wrong direction. That would be my answer about one distinction that we have with Jen's work. But I do think there is a parallel part of the concept, which is about concern. It's about concern for another group, not just can you put yourself in their shoes, but also, are you concerned once you get there about the way that group is being treated? And that empathic concern part comes a lot closer to what Jen would call sympathy, I think. So there is definitely overlap.
Thanks for this, Nick. This is really interesting. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. But so it seems like a lot of the narrative around like voter suppression laws is like, so the problem is not so much among racial minorities, but among whites who are supportive of these laws and are ostensibly supportive of them for like sort of race neutral reasons. So these like, you know, voter ID laws, for example, are kind of like presented as this race neutral, reasonable kind of, you know, security measure, you know, and they have various degrees of support. How would you expect group empathy to like mediate responses to those kinds of framings? Because it seems like in terms of like external validity, a lot of the time whites are hearing those kinds of messages. Like is group empathy activated in that instance? Or is it sort of just like not operating?
Yeah, we wouldn't expect it to be activated if that was the frame that people had in their mind. I mean, that is exactly consistent with what we would predict, with what we would find here in this paper, is that essentially that's these folks. They aren't seeing the frame that these are group targeted policies. All they're seeing is that this is in order to make our election safe. This is in order to reduce fraud. There's all of this potential fraud out there. We don't know exactly where it's coming from, and we can't really document it, but it's there. And if that's the only thing you hear, you don't hear actually this is only happening in Maricopa County, or it's only happening in neighborhoods where not a lot of white folks live. If you don't hear that, then yeah, there's no group empathy to attach to this kind of law. And so as people get into more and more siloed information environments where they're not hearing these kinds of things, then yeah, we think that would be harder. It would be much less likely to engage their outgroup empathy. Yeah.
Question from Christian. Did you examine whether empathetic concern versus perspective taking, these dimensions of empathy, function differently? For example, different main effects, different moderation effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have done that, and we very rarely find significant differences along those two dimensions. We argue in the, I don't know, the design or measurement chapter of the book that we try to measure it different ways and break it out into its constituent dimensions. We find that it hangs really well together, just as it does actually in the individual reactivity index, interpersonal reactivity index. So it behaves a lot like that, but we aren't finding a lot of differences between the predictive power of those two dimensions.
I'm going to keep the mic for a moment, if that's okay, because I have another question from our Zoom group. This is from Erica. Are the effects of group empathy on opposition to voting restrictions and other political attitudes similar across racial subgroups? Specifically, does group empathy operate similarly or as strongly among whites?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And the answer to that is, in this paper, the answer to that is yes. The data that we have suggests that it's almost identical in its associations across groups. And we usually find this actually. So it's another, I think, comforting piece of evidence that this is not something that only some groups have or engage. It's variation that's equivalently powerful among different groups. The means might be slightly different across groups, but the association with policies is almost always identical across these ethnic groups that you just mentioned. So thank you for your question. I'm always trying to imagine who these individuals are online and what their actual last name is, because sometimes I think I know who it is, but I'm not gonna say.
And actually, we have their last.
That's
name.
okay. That's okay. Yeah, just- Thank you for your online questions. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna ask my own question, because why not? Thank you. I was struck by how you were describing what empathy is. And so it'd be interesting, I just wish, or hope you could expand on that a bit. And then, but also it seems like it's good to create it. I mean, it seems like empathy is a positive social resource, right? It's could create cohesion. It seems to have these other sorts of important direct and spillover effects. I mean, that's one potential conclusion from this, is that, you know, are we in a society that that leads individuals to be empathetic, and what are its outcomes?
Yeah. So first of all, when we measure empathy at the interpersonal level, like psychologists would and have, and the way we're building on, we never find entirely positive results of empathy. Sometimes intra-group empathy leads to very negative effects for outgroups, right? Because you're protecting the outgroup because you think, yes, because you think they're a threat to the in-group. So it's important to remember what kind of empathy we're talking about here. If you would go with me in believing that there is this thing called outgroup empathy that's different than interpersonal empathy. So I'll say that, and then your other question is sort of how do you cultivate it? So, and in fact, in the book, we find sometimes that interpersonal reactivity or empathy is negatively associated with policies that we would think of as pro-social,
Right. Yep.
or compromise.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you grow this kind of empathy is, I think, part of your question. And because this kind of empathy, you would think, does lead to more egalitarian outcomes and electoral justice and other kinds of outcomes that we think are normative. And, you know, that is a really tough question because we believe it happens at a pretty young age. We believe that it's a skill and a motivation that has to be taught at a fairly young age. It's hard to change it as an adult. That's our theory. We haven't actually strongly tested that, but some folks have done things that we think are pretty close to testing that idea. For example, there's a paper that shows that using a really nice, ingenious regression discontinuity design that shows that people who just barely got into the Teach for America program and then spent a year teaching in inner city schools with kids that were underprivileged have much higher levels of pro-social welfare policy views than people who just barely didn't get into the program, but are similar to the group that got in on every other dimension. So kind of causally identified design for looking at the effect of spending time with an outgroup. Usually it's Teach for America is heavily white, and many of the schools that they get sent to are not. And so that's a case of positive contact with an outgroup that leads to. Now, did they measure empathy in the way we do? No, they didn't measure outgroup empathy in the way that we did. But that's the kind of experience. And my co-authors, Chidan and Jose, are both professors at El Paso, which is, many of you probably know, is a very diverse university. It's majority minority university. And so there's lots of opportunities there to study interactions between groups. And they actually have they have a class with a service component in the class, and they could randomly assign their own students to different kinds of activities around the city. And this is, I wish could have raised to the level of an actual study that we include in the chapter, but it's mostly anecdotal still. But they find that the kids who spent more time with even over a semester, we're scoring higher on the empathy scale that we came up with. So, and those were late teenagers. So we think that, it should have these effects, socializing experiences should have these effects on outgroups. But it's really hard to study those groups. Political scientists will tell you that, I think more often than psychologists will tell you that we can't study kids. I don't know why the psychologists find ways to do it and political scientists say it's too hard. You guys work harder than me. You have to get permission from like 5 different people in order to talk to children, is one reason. And we just like to get permission from one person to talk to them. Sarah.
I'm curious about sort of 2 different strains of argumentation that you've made in response to a couple different questions. One, which sort of argues that group empathy is a universal trait that sort of should exist regardless of the group that you're being told to express empathy for. And one, which is sort of, this is contingent on socialization in environments where you are sort of developing empathy for a particular group, either through contact or through learning. And so how much should we think of this as like universal, existing outside of the sort of groups that people develop empathy for in their lives, versus something that is like highly contingent on the environment that they're in and the types of groups that they are sort of socialized into developing empathy for?
Well, I want to, again, I'll just reemphasize the distinction between interpersonal or intra-family empathy, empathy for one's closest kin, which doesn't vary across groups and is very common and is what we would call what I think we would call a universal, except if you have huge deficits. Humans that are normal on lots of other things are almost by definition normal on empathy. They have high levels of the ability to empathize with other people, especially those close to them. But this other kind of empathy, if it exists, is not that way. It is much more contingent on the kinds of experiences you've had. So all I meant to say there is that there's equal amounts of variation within all groups, not that the groups are the same on average, whereas they are on average when we measure empathy in an interpersonal way. They are all the same. It's impossible for us, at least in the literature that we've studied, to show big differences across ethnic groups or racial groups on interpersonal empathy. That's not something that varies by.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the close of our time together, but I found the paper fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing it. And we'll be reading your book.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kate. Thank you all.